Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, just about. Thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime, maybe, or just before lunch for coming here today. I'm Dr. Julian Skyrme. I'm the Executive Director of Social Responsibility and Civic Engagement, and I'm chairing stroke interviewer questioner today because I've got two really good guests with me today who I'll ask to introduce themselves, and I'll just set the scene a little bit. So, Rose, first of all, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rose Broad. I'm a Professor of Criminology and Head of Department of Criminology at the moment. And yeah, I'm a researcher mainly in modern slavery and human trafficking.
Thanks, Rose. And Ian, please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ian Jarvey. I'm the university's Interim Head of Procurement and have been looking at our supply chains for a number of years.
Thanks, Rose, and thanks, Ian. So why are we doing today's session? And the question is, what is the University of Manchester doing to combat modern slavery? The reason we're doing today's session is because it's part of Anti-Slavery Week, which begins today. This is a great time to raise awareness of the issue of modern slavery in our organisation, in the University of Manchester. It's a chance to engage with you as colleagues, to engage with students, to engage with suppliers and also other partners, and show what the University of Manchester is doing to address modern slavery. And we do this through our research and our teaching, and Rose is going to talk a lot about that, but also through our own operations, through our supply chain as a major purchaser as a university. So we have many different ways of interfacing with the issue of modern slavery. And you might think slavery is a thing of the past. We talk a lot about transatlantic slavery in a UK context, but right now around the world, it's estimated there's around 50 million people who are still trapped in slavery around the world. And certainly that affects pretty much every country on earth, we think, and it definitely affects the UK, as you'll hear about in a moment. So although slavery looks quite different to what you might think of in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, modern slavery as a term encompasses lots of different types of slavery, as today's conversation will tease out. It includes human trafficking and also people born into slavery, and there's lots of definitions as well, and we'll touch on some of these today. But for most people, they would define modern slavery as being when an individual is exploited for use by others, whether that's for personal gain or commercial gain. It could be somebody who's tricked, it could be somebody who's coerced, it could be somebody who's forced. But in general, those people would lose their freedom, and it includes human trafficking, it includes forced labour, and it includes things like debt bondage as well. And in the UK, numbers are quite difficult, and Rose will talk about this in a moment, but recent statistics show there's probably around 12,000 people who've been referred to the authorities each year, but the numbers who are estimated to be trapped in modern slavery in the UK are estimated to be about 10 times more than that, probably around 130,000 people. So this isn't a niche issue, which is why we take this seriously at the University of Manchester and wanted to talk about it with you today. If you know a little bit about modern slavery, you might know a little bit about some of the people who could fall victim of this. It could be somebody working in a private home on your street. It could be a person working in a car wash where you might take your car to be washed. It could be a cleaner in an office. It includes definitely people trafficked into criminal activities. For example, cannabis farming is quite a big area at the moment. Sexual exploitation, trafficking into criminal activities, forced labour on farms. The construction sector is a big issue. Shops, nail bars was a big thing and still is to some extent. Car washes, manufacturing. So there's a range of different areas, and most people who are trafficked into this form of slavery come from overseas. I think Mo Farah actually did a lot to raise the issue about this with his own story. If you've not seen the documentary he did, it's really powerful, and I'd encourage you to watch that. What's interesting, though, is 31% of people are estimated who are victims of modern slavery to be British nationals, and around 4 in 10 of these are children as well, rather than adults. And that generally reflects a more recent trend where British children are forced into county lines drug trafficking, and foreign nationals can also be trafficked into forced labour, typically in cannabis production. So modern slavery is all around us, and I think today the discussion will talk about what research shows, how we're teaching students about this, how we're engaging the public and policymakers, and also what does it mean for a university with complex supply chains through its operations. So I'm really delighted we've got both Rose and Ian who can cover all of those different areas today. So what I'm going to do is just open up a conversation. Just to say, if you've got any questions, you'll notice we've disabled the chat feature because we've opened up a different feature called Q&A. So please, if you've got any questions as we go along, feel free to put those questions into the Q&A and we'll try to get to them towards the end. So that's me by way of introduction. I wanted to introduce Rose again now. Rose, you're an English language and linguistics graduate from Edinburgh, I noticed from your LinkedIn. You joined the university 15 years ago as a PhD student, and I don't think I've had a chance to say this, so congratulations on becoming a professor in criminology last year as well. That's quite a quick progress, I would say. I'm just interested, first of all, Rose, in terms of, before we start asking you about your expertise and your research on modern slavery, tell us about why did you become a researcher? What was it? Because you've taken perhaps a less typical route, I would say, into this. And what made you want to get interested in this topic? Tell us a little bit about your biography, first of all.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't come to academia until a bit later on. I worked initially in the police for about 3.5 years, and I think it's an amazing job, but it wasn't for me. And then I left. It wasn't for me because I actually wanted to spend more time with offenders and know why they'd done what they'd done, and that isn't really the role of the police. So then I worked for probation, which I really enjoyed, and I think from there, that kind of idea of wanting to know more about how people had ended up in those situations, I felt that more. So then I was doing a master's then at the university in criminology, and who then became my PhD supervisor popped into a lecture, a master's session that I was in, and he was looking for a researcher to do some work part-time on the facilitation, the illegal movement of people, so facilitating illegal migration basically. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. Maybe I can go part-time at work and do that part-time just in case I've not got enough on and do my master's. So I did that, and then through the course of meeting him, we then came up with this PhD project, which I then got, which was great. So that was ESRC funded PhD project, and then I've been here ever since. Thanks,
Rose. I mean, I think it's some people, obviously, as you know, who we work with, academics go typical university, masters, maybe PhD, and straight into academia. So some of that practical experience you got, has that helped you in your work, would you say, compared to some of your colleagues who maybe didn't have that experience in the police and in the probation service?
So, I mean, I wouldn't say that, because there's definitely some bits of things that they can do that I don't know. Like when I first started, because like say I did my first degree was in English language and linguistics, so it didn't have anything to do with crime. So there were times when I was doing my master's where they would say, oh, this theory of crime, and I think, I don't know what that is, I've never heard of that. Quickly have a look in an undergraduate textbook to find out what that was. But having the experience of the criminal justice system in the police and in probation, and I also did some work for a domestic abuse charity, Respect. So I had that kind of experience of the system, of lots of kind of of what it was like to be a practitioner. So definitely that helps. But you know, I don't think there's lots of things my colleagues can do that I can't do so well.
Yeah, thanks. So tell us then, just moving into, because you've been looking into modern slavery, almost the whole of your research focus has been in that, and you're somebody who is one of not just the universities, but you're a really highly cited author now into research into modern slavery, which is why you're here today, of course. Tell us then, I said a little bit in my intro, tell us a little bit about victims of modern slavery, and what has the research that you've done shown us about who are the victims of modern slavery?
So my work has mainly been with perpetrators, so I can talk about victims a little. Yeah. I think one of the things that's really important is that there's an overlap between those two groups. I think it's maybe easier for people to think, oh, there's victims over here and perpetrators over here, but it's not as straightforward as that. And I think if people think about what they know about modern slavery or human trafficking, it probably might come from like Taken films with Liam Neeson, or, you know, trafficking and modern slavery have been in lots of TV programs, and it's often portrayed as this quite stereotypical, you know, victim over here and a perpetrator over here, but actually there's a lot of overlap between those two groups, certainly with convicted traffickers anyway. Like you said, Julian, at the beginning, it's a big group of people. In 2023, there were just over 17,000 people that were referred to the National Referral Mechanism, which is the system in the UK where victims are identified as victims of modern slavery. So there are some similarities, but there's obviously that 17,000 people. There's also lots of differences. I think they're often people who've been let down by the state, whether that's in this country or their country of origin. So they've been let down in some way, whether that's because the state is unstable or whether that's because they haven't had a capable guardian. And they're vulnerable to exploitation because they don't have rights that other people might have. So they might not have the right to work, so they might be undocumented and they can't get access to work that people can apply for. They can't get access to benefits. They haven't got many work options, so they need to work at the kind of edges of things that are legal. So that could be on the edges of legitimate markets, working for cash, or it might be that they have to sell drugs or sex because they just don't have very many other options. And then I think the chances of victimization are then increased by other situations like being care leavers, as in they've been in the care system, or they have learning difficulties, or they're isolated in the community for lots of reasons. And all of those features that I've just said, if you look at the prison population, those things are really similar. So we then see lots of similarities between victims and then people who end up in prison for these offences.
Thanks, Rose. So you gave some examples there of, I'm just thinking of people on the call to make this tangible. You talked about, you know, the drugs trade and the sex trade, etc. Presuming no one on the call is involved in those, where else might they encounter modern slavery? If you were to go out on a Saturday walk around Manchester, around your neighbourhood, where might you see it in everyday life, do you think, without realising it?
Yeah, I mean, people will maybe have seen the nail bars and car washes kinds of adverts that have been done. So Operation Challenger, which is the Greater Manchester anti-slavery and anti-trafficking response, have done some awareness campaigns around those kinds of things. But I think it's just almost in any service or thing that you buy, that there's some kind of supply chain there that could involve it. And I'm sure Ian will talk about that more. So, you know, I think often students will say, what do do about it? And we might think about, what are you buying? Are you buying some jeans? Where are they made? Who made them? How much are they? Are they £10? Because it's fairly unlikely that you can make a pair of jeans for that price without it involving some kind of shortcut in some way. So I think, you know, and if you go to a restaurant, there's lots of exploitation in the service industry, so hotels and restaurants. So really anywhere. So yeah, I think it's a good point to make that, you know, we might associate this with drugs and selling sex, which people think, oh, that's nothing to do with me. But also, this is also labour exploitation, which is just every other market.
Yeah, thanks. And then, so you mentioned most of your research is about the perpetrators of modern slavery. Where's that taking you? What are the key sort of things you've been able to conclude from doing lots of work about the perpetrators?
Taken me into lots of prisons, which is always really interesting. I always think in criminology, we're trying to get into prisons and other people are trying to get out. There's lots of ethical issues trying to get into prison and to do the research. But I think, you know, none of this work is about it's not to say that the victim view is obviously very important. And there are people who've made lots of money from this, but I think we have to listen to people who've been convicted, because that's the only way that we can understand how people ended up in that situation and how we're ever going to kind of try and do something about it to stop that, because you can learn some things from victims, but we need to speak to the people who have done this too. So a bit like victims, they're not a homogenous group. Like you said at the beginning, what's happened since the Modern Slavery Act is that it's grown the type of activity that's come under modern slavery. So sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, that's all of industry, domestic servitude, so exploitation in your house, county lines drug dealing, which people probably heard of, forced marriage and sham marriage. So it's lots and lots of things that come under this. So if you think about all of those things, the kinds of things that you need to do those activities are very different. So the types of people are different too. So having a sort of stereotypical modern slavery perpetrator is quite hard. So the types of people vary a lot. And some of them have got these backgrounds of vulnerability, particularly the ones that are convicted, lack of opportunity. So they end up making some money, but maybe not as much as you would expect from the kind of stereotypical portrayal of the people in the media and in sort of fiction. So they're people who often have similar backgrounds but have ended up as exploiters, and they may have previously been victimized as well, which is often the case.
Yeah, so you mentioned there around the different types of perpetrators, and I guess some of them, just listening to what you said, would know that they're committing a crime. I guess some people, when you interview them, maybe others. Would I be right? Just excuse my ignorance if this is a really bad question, but would some people, perhaps because of different cultural differences, think that they're not committing a crime? It's just part of a different culture. For example, I'm thinking around forced marriage as an issue.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be careful about saying that some cultures allow exploitation, because that's probably not the case. But I think certainly legal frameworks are different everywhere. So there are people who say, "Oh, I didn't know that was a crime. I didn't know that you're not allowed to do that, because where I live, that's allowed. You know, you can't." I think an example that I came across early on in Manchester was to do with I'm a bit worried about getting this wrong, but I think it's about a Nigerian employment of not children but older young adults who would then do childcare and domestic responsibilities in return for education. And then there's a Nigerian community leader who was in Manchester who said that a lot of her work involves her telling people, you can't do that here, that's not allowed, whereas that would be a practice that would be okay, is not allowed here. So I think there is some of that kind of, in a different context, you can't do that here. And like I say, there are people who know that what they're doing is not right, but certainly there's a spectrum of things that go on.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. And you mentioned about the Modern Slavery Act. I didn't say anything about that actually in my introduction, but just for people who've perhaps not heard about it, did you want to talk a little bit about its background and what, as research and what you've shown, has it had a positive impact? I think it has, but it's also raised some issues. But if you had to sort of give people a quick 101 on the Modern Slavery Act, what would you say about that?
Yeah, so the Modern Slavery Act came in 2015, and prior to that, people were convicted for human trafficking, but it was under a number of different acts. So there was work that was done at the kind of early 2010s that we need to bring everything under one act. It introduced the role of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. It changed the terminology from human trafficking to modern slavery, and brought things together in one place. And it also introduced the transparency in the supply chain provisions, which Ian will probably talk about, I'm sure. So I think, there's some successes. There's more awareness of it. I think there's more awareness of modern slavery, human trafficking than there was. The Act also introduced the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, which we talked about before, which has identified increasing numbers year on year. So there is a process of identification that is increasingly identifying victims. And there are pockets of good practice in terms of investigation and victim support. There are also problems. Although there are more people referred through the NRM, there's a lot of research that shows that they're not really being safeguarded or supported properly. And that's particularly concerning, because as we get more people, it's harder to support them because there's more of them. So there's problems around support and safeguarding. And the transparency provisions have encouraged reporting by corporations, but they're not mandatory. So research shows that responses are quite superficial. The rates of prosecution are really low. They're as low as sexual offences and rape, which are really low, which is problematic. So we see increasing number of victims and very, very low levels of prosecution. And the sandwiching of the Act between immigration acts as well, and the kind of increasingly hostile immigration environment in the UK, has meant that for people that are undocumented who are, vulnerable to exploitation, it's much more difficult for those people to access support. So that kind of context has made it more difficult for the support to be accessed through the Modern Slavery Act.
Yep. Thanks, Rose, for that. And certainly it's a nice segue into some things with Ian, as you mentioned there, in terms of the Modern Slavery Act, because one of the reasons I'm chairing today's discussion, I chair our group on this in the university, which Rose and Ian are part of, and it's put legal requirements on organisations, the Modern Slavery Act as well, including the University of Manchester. So I think it's since the introduction of that act, actually, Ian, that you've been involved in this and have developed some expertise. Ian, I should say, as well, has worked at the University of Manchester in procurement for around 20 years now, I think, Ian, isn't it? And he's a member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And if you work in procurement, the Modern Slavery Act has been a really big deal, for you in terms of if you're overseeing procurement in an organisation. So, Ian, all that talk of nail bars and prostitution and cockle workers and everything, people might be thinking, what the heck has this got to do with the University of Manchester's operations and procurement? So tell us why, from your perspective, this is so important then, first of all.
Yeah, I think obviously Rose has highlighted the sort of uniquely human aspect of modern slavery, which is people are probably wondering how that translates into our operational practice. So I think everyone on the call will recognise what a big, complex and diverse organisation we are. I'll just give a little bit of complex around sort of context around our suppliers and our supply chains. So last year, in order to support our teaching, research and operational activities, our invoice spend with our supply base was £597 million. So just shy of £600 million. And that spend was across a whole range of categories. Obviously, support our estate, be that refurbishments, rebuilds, whatever. IT, hardware, software, infrastructure, laboratory, equipment, consumables, library, travel, catering, temporary staff, sport, residences, all those areas that we absolutely rely on to do what we need to do. So just under £600 million, 80% of that was with a cohort of around 900 formally contracted suppliers. But during that financial year, through our finance system, we also processed payments to a total of 7,700 suppliers. So you get hopefully an indication from those brief figures of how big, how diverse and how complex our supply chains are, which we ultimately rely on to do what we do.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So just in terms of thinking about our supply chain then, the 2015 Act, what obligations did that put on you in procurement?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of that whole area, it's been a pretty long journey for us. We've been working to embed things like social responsibility and environmental and ethical issues within procurement for quite a long time, to make sure that they are embedded and the contracts recognise them. But the 2015 Act, the Modern Slavery Act, provided a real focus on supply chains in particular, simply because it imposed an obligation on organisations with a turnover of £36 million and a footprint in the UK to publish, as Rose said, an annual modern slavery statement. And that statement has to, or the advice is, it follows a particular format to explain how you manage that risk, how you understand that risk, how you manage that risk in your supply chains. And it's got to be visible publicly through your main web pages, all of which we complied with. I think we were quite proactive as an organisation when this legislation came out. We established a human trafficking and modern slavery policy, and we've published a statement annually since. I think our 9th one, Julian, is currently going through the approval process at the minute, and hopefully that's demonstrated some ongoing changes and improvements year on year through that process.
And then, so you mentioned there about looking at our risk, Ian, and our processes. So what are the big risks for the University of Manchester, would you say?
Yeah,
which sectors, if you like,
well, I mean, the high risk ones: catering, IT, temporary staff, construction. All of those, I think Rose mentioned, the type of supply chains and working practices that they rely on. So there are high risk areas haven't changed particularly over the duration of that time. I think
drill into then, Ian. You're not saying within catering that somebody employed who you might buy a sandwich off on campus today is a victim of modern slavery. I think you're talking about supply chains, aren't you?
Absolutely.
So tell me a bit about our systems and processes then, and that's the same with construction as well. We don't employ builders in the university. I don't think we can. They're part of our supply chain, of course. We produce contracts. So when we're doing that with the construction sector or the catering sector, just for people who don't know, talk us through how we might actually try to ensure that we're not inadvertently supporting modern slavery then. What that look like in practice?
Yeah, just a little bit of background. As an organisation, and we're not unique in this, most public sector and quasi-public sector organisations are the same, that we don't have a direct link necessarily between what we do and the product we produce. We don't have a physical product. We don't sort of buy things to sell them on. So we don't have any direct custody of our supply chains. We rely very much on our contracted suppliers, what are known as tier one suppliers, and we rely on their supply chains basically. The other thing, I guess, is that operationally we do lack expertise in understanding supply chains and resource to manage those. So we very much rely on our tier one suppliers. So we've obviously adapted to that particular situation by managing that on a risk-based basis, as you say. In order to understand the risk that we face, we categorize our suppliers using a national higher education taxonomy, which is based on the majority supply of those suppliers. As part of that national taxonomy, we undertake a broad-based risk appraisal of those suppliers annually, including supply chain risk around modern slavery. At an institutional level, as part of our slavery reporting, we look at geographic risk as well. We look at the risk around products and areas of the globe that might be more susceptible to child labour, forced labour, etc. So we keep an eye on that side of things. Finally, we make use of external validation. We're a member of an affiliate member of an organisation called Electronics Watch, which does lots of deep dives into supply chains around electronic products, IT products, and is moving into electric vehicles, and also through Slave Free Alliance, which you mentioned earlier, which is a social enterprise of hope for justice. We have access there to lots of information on working practices and supply chains, and we can also exchange information with other members of that organisation. So collectively, we can take a sort of mature picture of our operations and our risk exposure and address that appropriately.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to go to, there's a question which I think cuts across what you've just been saying there, Ian. I don't know if you've seen it as well, Rose. I'm going to put it to you actually, Rose, if that's okay. There's a really good question by Johan Rott, and he says, I agree every industry exploits labour. So how do we then draw a line between, let's say, underpaid work and modern slavery? And I think a really good example would be, we don't buy a lot of apparel, university gear, but we do buy some. And that would be a good example, you know, where we might be buying stuff, let's say, stereotypically, we might be buying some clothing from Bangladesh. They pay the workers terribly, you might argue, by British standards, but it's not illegal. It's legal in a Bangladeshi context. Is there an ethical dilemma for the university then in its supply chain, or where does ethics end and the law begins? And it's a really good point. I can see Sinead's on the call today, our university general counsel as well. And I think these are interesting questions about ethics and law. What do you think about that, Rose, for something like, let's take the example of university apparel?
I think that is a really important question, and there's probably different answers depending on what you want to look at, because a woman called Clara Skrivankova wrote about a continuum of exploitation. So at one side you've got decent work, and at the other side you've got absolute slavery where somebody's not being paid at all, and then between that you've got a whole range of different situations where there are various,
and the legal pendulum will vary across that scale,
and depending on how the law is interpreted. So there's certainly kind of how case law develops that over time. There's also a section that's towards the side of decent work, that's into kind of health and safety legislation. So there's a whole raft of things that have to be done there before it tips into criminal circumstances. And my colleague John Davis in criminology does a lot of work about that kind of part of it, of that sort of overlap between decent work and then how that tips over into criminal exploitation, whereas my work is situated much more at the other end. I think apparel is an interesting example, and it's something that I've done a little bit of work on in recent years with John and with Amy Benstead, who's in the School of Materials. And that's been really interesting because, I mean, modern slavery is a very interdisciplinary problem, and it's mainly been defined as a crime problem, which I think is a problem in itself because it is a crime, but it's too big. Like, the police can't be doing everything, and they, you know, partly having it defined as a crime problem is a problem because it sort of excludes other people. So doing this work with Amy and John has been interesting. Amy does work about fashion supply chains, about exploitation in fashion supply chains. And I don't know if anybody, the Shein documentary that was on a couple of years ago about the fast fashion company Shein was absolutely fantastic about understanding that kind of process that you talked about, Julian, where, you know, the clothes are made in China, where the laws are totally different than they are here. And it's completely fine to buy those things here. We might want to think about, as a university, would we want to sell clothes that were made by Shein? I would say that wouldn't be a great decision. Ethically, that's not right, but it's not illegal. Yeah. So I think we had this in criminology, actually. We bought some hoodies and we had a lot of thinking, where are we going to get them from? And it's very difficult, like Ian said, you know, you've got tiers of, so you can maybe try and look at the first one, but after that, you're very trusting of that supplier to have done everything right. And some people do, but some people don't. So I think the university has decisions to be made, just like with environmental concerns, about how socially responsible is this purchase. And I think, like with anything, if you are happy with the decisions that you've made and you can sort of justify them, then I think that's all you can do. And certainly if it's not legal, then I will obviously say no to that. But I think that's a fairly low bar.
Yeah,
I think just picking up on that, Julian, as you say, I think you both said it is a continuum, this, and obviously, you know, there's the strict modern slavery side of things, but obviously we're a living wage foundation supplier, which, you know, it gives us a moral high ground, but it gives us a benchmark in which to put our suppliers as well. And you know, we have a supply chain code of conduct which talks about proper employment practices and good processes and freedom of association and equal treatment and proper working practices and so it is a continuum. We would try and insist on those in our terms, but it's a difficult thing to do in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. We've got about 10 more minutes, Rose. I'm going to ask you for the next couple of minutes if you could say a little bit about, we talked a lot about research, of course. The other side of the coin of what the university does, of course, is we teach thousands of students every year. You teach some of those, but not all of them. Tell us about what's a typical student, are they likely to come across these in which subject areas? Clearly they're doing criminology. Maybe you could say a bit about that and in law, but what about other parts of the university might a student be likely to learn about these things at Manchester?
I think, in criminology, we talk about it in terms of organised crime, which is, I don't know, a bit, I would argue that most of it is not organised, as we might sort of understand it, but that's where we teach it. So yeah, definitely teach it in criminology, and also in terms of sort of social networks and how we might understand that in the makeup of offending. But there's lots of other places, like I said, because it's such an interdisciplinary problem. And I've worked with, so I know Amy does teaching around exploitation in supply chains and how you might think about that in fast fashion and kind of garment supply chains. In the business school, there's work on, like you said, about decent work and the overlap there between business practices and business responsibilities, and with the corporate social responsibility and the pillars of business and human rights. In sociology, do work about the illegal movement of people and exploitation, home working in different countries and how that can lead to exploitation. In social stats, so any kind of social statistics, there's lots of statistics around modern slavery and about how human trafficking really, and how we can understand the problem using that. I also do work with a colleague in politics, Nick Turnbull, about international policy making. He and I have got a project that starts in January, actually, a Leave Hume project on international policy making and how that different jurisdictions do things in different ways and how more or less successful they are. So you can learn about it in lots of different, and social work. So if we think about vulnerability of people, and so it comes into people's students' consciousness in lots of different ways. And it may not be called modern slavery, it will be in some of those things, but probably exploitation is a more useful term because it's more understandable and it covers a wider load of activities than something that's very legally based on, does this fall under the Slavery Act? Actually, exploitation is probably a better way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and there's so many different disciplines there, as you've mentioned, and I guess we'd want our students to have general awareness about this. They might, I don't know, be in electrical engineering, then I'm guessing they perhaps don't learn about conflict minerals. Maybe they do, I don't know, but it's something that if you're going to work in that sector, exploitation, I think is a good way to think about this, and hopefully lots of our students, regardless of their discipline, are learning about that at Manchester. You mentioned then some of the work you do with Nick on global. I wanted to talk about those three levels of global, national, local, really, because you do a lot of work, Rose, as well, with policymakers, with local groups. So maybe a little bit about how we think about this as a global issue. You've done some work. What does that show then? Because clearly you can only tackle this at global scale, but that must be really hard from a research and impact point of view to try and change policies globally, because I guess the UN doesn't really have much sway, does it? You're more reliant on national policy systems that are different. Is that right?
Yeah, kind of. The UN developed the Palermo Protocol in 2000, which has got a very long name, but it basically defined what we understand of as human trafficking. And from the Palermo Protocol, different jurisdictions interpreted the protocol. But because the protocol was embedded within the Convention against transnational organised crime, it really, from a global level, defined human trafficking as a problem of organised crime. That then, it has the end part of the sentences, especially women and children. So it defined it as a problem where the victims are women and children and as a problem of organised crime, which is kind of okay, but it means that that's how it was defined globally, and then that's how it trickled down into national legislation. And it's a very specific form of that. And there was a lot of work at the time, a kind of opposed view to say we need to think of this in terms of human rights, because that's going to be more useful. That's going to be a better framing for victims. Yes, there's organised crime, but actually it's more useful to think about this from a human rights perspective. That didn't work really. And over time, things have improved a little bit, but that kind of framing from the beginning created something that now, nearly 25 years later, remains and has fed into it being very much primarily perceived as a crime problem. So, that's where we are. Global.
And then what people perhaps don't realise is the huge amount of work we do in criminology. I know in other areas, but that's yours, Rose. What we're doing across Greater Manchester then on a really local level, because we talked about the National Act around this, the 2015 Modern Slavery Act, but why then in Greater Manchester? What can we do? What have you been doing? Could you give colleagues some examples? Because you've done a huge amount, I think, locally, haven't you?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate for about probably more than 10 years, more than 10 years, been engaged with Operation Challenger, which I said is the Greater Manchester anti-slavery response, which is embedded in Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Greater Manchester Police, and then all of the NGOs that work in that area in Greater Manchester. And they have a really active forum, the NGO forum, which is run by a charity, which I think is really important to have that kind of person that leads that part of it that represents victims. And obviously the statutory agencies have got a big role to play there, but having that kind of lead from a charity is really important. The multi-agency response to modern slavery, like I say, has to move away a bit from it being police owned. So to have that sort of multi-agency response is really important. And they also have a business forum, which is how I've ever met Ian in the first place. And the university is part of that Greater Manchester Business Forum that looks at businesses that exist and operate in Manchester and how they're involved in anti-slavery work in the region. So I think the university's been really engaged with both Manchester and the kind of the Northwest in general in their kind of safeguarding modern slavery work that I've done around, cuckooing more recently, the safeguarding Greater Manchester safeguarding policy for cuckooing.
Tell us about cuckooing there as a concept, because people may not have heard about that.
Yeah, cuckooing is a bit of a problematic term. We might want to think about it as home-based exploitation, so exploitation that takes place in someone's house, and it's to do with someone's home being taken over and then used for the purposes of illegal activity, usually drug distribution. So it has often county lines and cuckooing are put together, but it can also be for other things like storage of stolen goods or weapons, so it doesn't have to be for drug dealing. So cuckooing isn't a specific offence, and this is again something that has a kind of link between local practice and what's happening nationally. So there is a movement towards creating an offence of cuckooing. I think it shouldn't be called that, because I think the term is really a problem. We could call it something else, but we can kind of feed in from a local level or a regional level how Greater Manchester have dealt with that and how it fits or doesn't fit with the Modern Slavery Act, and whether or not that needs to be changed. So there's been some work around that.
Yeah, good. I'm going to go to some questions. There's some really good questions in the Q&A, and I think probably a few of them are more for you as a guest, Rose, but I might be wrong. I'm just going to work my way from the bottom up. There's a really good sort of philosophical question, first of all, by Mark Gilmore. If we legalise prostitution and drugs, would that reduce the scope of slavery in the UK?
That's quite a complicated question. There's a piece of research done called Shifting Sands that wanted to look at the relationship between models of legalization of sex work and human trafficking, and there's no relationship. So they looked at different models, like from abolitionist models to very open models, like you would think about probably more often in the Netherlands.
Yep.
Versus something like New Zealand, and lots of countries in between. They looked at 9 countries and how they match, and there's just no relationship. What happens?
Interesting.
There's always a market for things that don't fit within the legal market. So just how you have exploitation in potato picking, the same thing would happen, but in sex work, and in drug distribution. So you would still have the same thing. It would just be regulated. So unfortunate, it would be good if that. I think there are other advantages, but in terms of
but that's not one in terms of slavery. That's really interesting. There's a question by Grain Wrigley. Has the university ever identified slavery within its networks or suppliers, and what would be the plan if that happened? Ian, have we ever identified an actual example?
None of which I'm aware. Obviously, organisations like Electronics Watch do raise issues around certain factories in certain regions, and we work with them and the supplier to address those. I think that the second question is, what would we do if we found it? I think the advice, it's a bit of a nightmare scenario, I'll be honest with you, but the sort of textbook answer to that is that you work with the supplier to to address that issue and overcome it and stop it. I guess it would depend on the nature of the issue and the seriousness of it, but generally speaking, if it's a problem in a factory or somewhere, we would work with that supplier to change behaviours as much as we could.
Okay. There's a question, I think this is for you, Rose, from Paul Carter. Has the government filled the Modern Slavery Commissioner's post yet, as it was vacant for several years? That's been done, is that right?
Yeah, it was filled in the summer with Eleanor Lyons. I met with her in the summer, and she's very keen to be kind of involved with research that's happening. So yeah, good. It's terrible to be vacant for so long.
Yeah. Thanks. And then Philippe had a question. How can the URM identify if their staff or students are themselves or their family members victims of modern slavery? Are there mechanisms that allow for such identification of staff or students?
I think I don't know of any particular mechanisms of identification other than those that exist kind of more generally in Manchester. I know that actually I was contacted. I've got a case studentship, which is where a PhD student is jointly supervised by an academic and a person from outside academia. And the outside supervisor is a person from the regional organised crime unit. And she's doing research on exploitation of homeless migrants in Manchester. And the supervisor contacted me saying that he wanted to come into university to do some training on students' susceptibility to being victims, particularly through cooking and kind of drug distribution, because there's been an increase in that in the region. So I can talk to somebody about that. But I think that would be useful to have that kind of training and awareness.
Yeah,
I think, Julian, one of the reasons why we established the oversight group for modern slavery was to make sure we joined up with our other safeguarding initiatives in the institution as well. So there are those in place which hopefully should support those sort of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Ian. I'm going to suggest that Will's question and Rose, if you could look at that and respond digitally afterwards, maybe if we can. I just wanted to, because I'm conscious of time, I just wanted to sort of finish up really by just asking you, first of all, Ian, if lots of people on the call today work at the university. I think most people are, too many people can buy things in the university, probably. That's part of the challenge of all of this. So most people are involved in purchasing decisions. If you had one message for people who buy stuff in the university, what would it be in terms of modern slavery?
Yeah, I think it would be, where practicable, please use our formally contracted suppliers. They do go through a due diligence process. They are managed on an ongoing basis. If you can't use them for whatever reason, I think, picking up Rose's point, please look about the cost of what you're buying rather than just the price. If it's exceptionally cheap, that's usually a red flag that there may well be something more going on in the supply chain there.
Yeah, and Rose, I had one question for you. Before that, there's one that came in advance. I think we've covered the other ones that came in advance through our presentation, but there was one point that was made by a colleague. Just, can we do more public engagement activities to raise awareness of this outside the university? Did you want to share some examples of work you've done with NGOs, for example, where we are engaging the public and citizens across perhaps Greater Manchester or beyond?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of work. It's interesting, particularly for my work, I think, because it's perpetrator focused. It has a few more obstacles to public engagement because it's perhaps not always as attractive. People are not always as open to hearing those voices. Like I say, I think really important that we do listen to those people, because that's the only way we can stop other people from kind of understanding people are involved. I'm going to London on Friday. Friday is actually Anti-Slavery Day.
That's right.
I'm going to London with David Gadd, who's also in criminology, and he and I are doing some work with His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service with people who, because they're writing a strategy for modern slavery offenders and victims who are in prison and probation. So we're able to work with them with the research that we did with the perpetrators of modern slavery to think about how they can be responded to while they're in prison, and also how we might think about the overlap between victims and exploiters. And so we've got some very specific engagement from our research. And then I think more generally, I've had 3 or 4 PhD students who go along regularly to the NGO forum in Manchester and kind of share their research and work with NGOs to disseminate their findings and kind of think about how the things that they found in their research can be useful to organisations. And then over the summer, which was really interesting, I did a presentation as part of Manchester History's festival with Natalie Zacek from American History. And I think I did miss that out when I was talking about teaching, because I think the introduction of the term modern slavery has really reminded people that slavery has a long history. So students will also come across, teaching in slavery in terms of history. And her work, which I don't know if you, I think, know a bit more than me, Julian, about the history of the university and how the links with slavery there.
Yeah, there was an amazing exhibition at the John Rylands, which was Masters student led. So Masters students did their own research into some of the early benefactors of the university. And of course, we're called Cottonopolis for a reason in Manchester. It's the capital, cotton capital of the world. It was at one point. And of course, a lot of that cotton was slave picked. So you don't have to make too many joining of dots together to get to the connection between lots of the beautiful buildings you see in Manchester and the wealth, and particularly in finance and insurance and banking. And it was very difficult to imagine any wealth in Manchester separate to wealth from cotton. So that's something I know that we've done a huge amount of public engagement on more recently, and we'll continue to do that. So I just wanted to finish up with one question in terms of our students, Rose, in terms of you talked about students who more formally learn about issues of modern slavery, but we want to share this message to our students. Is there sort of one message you could inspire them to take away in terms of why they should be interested in this question this week when we're trying to have conversations about modern slavery? What do you say to any student, perhaps in any university?
I think, like you say, students are learning and they may or may not learn about modern slavery, but they will go on to work and they will go on, well, they are already consumers and they will go on to be consumers more. So I think just to think about not just the legal, what's legal, but what would be the most ethical thing to do. And like Ian said, think about as consumers, what are they buying? As workers, what are they buying in their work? What kinds of organizations are they having a relationship with, in work and as people, and to have maybe a higher bar of that. And I know that can be quite a utopian thing to ask, and I think there's a big ask around that in terms of environmental sustainability, but just to think about, do you need things, and if you do need things, can you get them in a better way, whether that's in work or as an individual, I think would be something that would help.
I think it's a really good analogy with environmental sustainability. We don't say is something sustainable or not, and I think the crossover with modern slavery and exploitation, it's a really, I think if there's one point I'd take away, which I've learned today listening to the conversation, it's that, it's not a simple, this is an example of slavery and this isn't. There are degrees of difference, just like with sustainability. I'd also add, Rose, our students are not just, of course they are citizens, they are people who will buy things. They're also much more likely to go on into leadership positions in the future. And so they'll be sitting on the boards, they'll be making some of those more important decisions about, procurement strategies and supply chains. They're much more likely to do that than an average person because they've had the privilege of a university education. So I think that's a really good message for us all today as part of this week. So just to say, we do need to finish up. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've learned so much, and I'm sure other people have, and it's a really good product for us to be able to share with colleagues across the institution. I just wanted to thank, first of all, Ian, thank you very much for sharing what the University of Manchester does. It's been really interesting, and people have been able to ask questions today. And Rose, it's been wonderful to have your expertise today. It's a really important week. I hope things go well on Friday with your work with the probation service as well. I think that's a really interesting part of what we're doing. Thank you very much. We will make this available if you'd like to share this with any colleagues as well who have missed this, who you feel would benefit from knowing about this conversation. We'll make sure that we share the recording of it with you afterwards. So I just, one last person to thank is Maria Papa, who hasn't got a camera on, but she's helped organise all of this today. Maria, thank you so much for getting this out, for advertising and working with StaffNet and making sure this all run so smoothly today as it did. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your Mondays and the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.